Last episode, we were finally able to drive the Jeep back to Rob's house. The next day, he was driving on the highway when suddenly everything shut off and refused to restart.
Well, that didn't last long.
He performed a quick and dirty spark test on the side of the road and found that there was no spark coming from the distributor. This could mean a couple of different things, and Rob and his fiancée really didn't want to try to fix it on the side of the highway, so they called the tow truck and had it towed to my house since they were already in the area. Pretty soon it was in my driveway for the first time. The first thing we did was use a spark tester to verify that no spark result. Which one did you check? Oh, 2.
Finally got it.
And indeed, there was no spark to any of the cylinders. With that result, we pushed the Jeep into the garage and set about looking for the culprit. First thing I wanted to look at was the distributor and the rotor, since we had never taken the cap off before, and I wanted to get a look at the condition they were in.
So $31.99 for a cap and rotor.
Most likely it's not that.
Not the cap and rotor. You still think it's the coil?
I don't think it would just outright die like that. At least it's had some time to cool down.
Oh yeah, it's had plenty of time to cool down.
Once the cap was off, there was no obvious defect, so we just cleaned up the terminals and put it back together.
And this, children, is why you listen to your dentist and always brush your teeth. Broken down Jeeps are the best way to spend your holiday weekend. We also tried to test the AC, and it gets cold like very gradually, but it seemed to just kind of stop at 78 degree air.
That's not bad. You should be able to just recharge it then.
Yeah, that's not terrible. You can feel it getting colder.
Just to be thorough, we retested the spark after that, but had the same result. Nope, no spark. Next up, we took a look at the ignition coil.
The only way to find out what the issues are is to drive the damn thing. Can't test that kind of stuff just sitting in the driveway. And I'm sure once we fix this, something else will break too.
I don't know why this is a bolt in the nut in the most impossible to reach locations.
Oh, nice. All these things in such convenient locations.
Yeah. And conveniently rusty. It wasn't the easiest thing to do, but eventually we got it unbolted and gave it a visual examination. The plastic housing is cracked, so it should probably be replaced, but it passes a multimeter test, so it most likely is not the problem. Since this Jeep is a 96, it's possible there is a diagnostic trouble code in the computer, but we did not have a code reader on hand at this time. The check engine light was still on, but we assumed it was just because of that O2 sensor right at the end of the open exhaust. If it was an older model, we could check the flash codes and maybe get some information that way. After doing some research on this issue online, we quickly came across a common failure point for these cars, and that is the crankshaft position sensor. We tried to do a multimeter test on the crankshaft position sensor based on some things we read online, but we weren't quite able to get consistent results. We also tested the sensor across 2 of the pins, in our case the 2 that don't lead to the purple wire. With the sensor on the vehicle, we got a reading of 0 ohms, or a closed connection. From what we read, there should be infinite resistance between these 2 pins. After this testing, we later read online that you could test for this by checking the fuel pressure, since the computer will also turn off the fuel pump relay if it detects an issue with the crankshaft position sensor. So we all hopped in a different car and ran to a parts store to buy a new crank position sensor and a new ignition coil, just for good measure. First, we installed the new ignition coil and tested that out. But unsurprisingly, this didn't fix the issue.
Okay, no spark.
Next up, we unbolted the old crank position sensor. This sensor is bolted to the transmission bell housing on the upper driver's side and is a bit tricky to reach. But with 2 long extensions and a swivel socket, it was no problem to get it unbolted. Just be very careful not to drop any bolts into the bell housing. And before we install the new sensor, we can test them both on the bench side by side. First, the old sensor reading 0 ohms across the power and ground pins. Next, we can see that the new sensor reads infinite resistance or open circuit across those same 2 pins. This certainly seems to indicate that the old sensor is indeed faulty. Since this is a 2-bolt sensor, the air gap is preset and you don't need to mess with it. If yours is a 1-bolt sensor or has slotted holes, you need to make sure there is enough space between the flex plate or flywheel and the end of the sensor. You do not want those 2 parts to meet. With the new sensor bolted in place, we repeated the same multimeter test as before, but again couldn't really get consistent results, so I'm not too sure what we were doing wrong there. We put a wrench on the front and turned the crankshaft by hand. Supposedly you'll see the signal fluctuate between 5 and 0 volts as the crank is turned, but regardless, it was time to test the new sensor. With the multimeter removed and everything put back together except the fuel pump relay, we performed another spark test. And finally, we have a nice bright spark. So we hooked that wire back up to the spark plug, reinstalled the fuel pump relay, and gave the engine a chance to start. It instantly came back to life and was chugging along just as well as before. So they were able to hop back in the Jeep and once again hit the road. Well, briefly, because pretty soon after that, the car has developed a new issue where it seems to have a lot of trouble above 2,000 RPM and stutters and stumbles. It still seems to run fine below that, but this means it is unsuitable for anything but low-speed driving. Rob has replaced the fuel filter and tried a couple of other small things, like hooking the old ignition coil back up, but nothing has seemed to make a difference. It's possible there's a fault with this new crank position sensor and it's causing an issue, but at this point, we just don't know. Since it seems like there are a lot of Jeep enthusiasts out there who are very familiar with these cars, let us know in the comments what you think this sounds like, and maybe together we can figure this out.
Now that we replace these, this thing could run another 300,000 miles or more. Yeah. Give or take.
We just added $5 to the mile.
It's actually gonna gain gas as it drives.
You gotta go faster. Okay, not that fast. We found this pack of gum in the car that expired around 8 years ago. It started with us giving it a try, which ended exactly as it seems like it would, because it tastes quite bad. And then things got a little out of hand.
4 out of 5 dentists agree you should chew expired gum.
Can't drive this like this. It's gonna smell minty.
Oh. Stop! Stop eating it!
Let's play get all the chunks of gum from the Jeep. This is why I can't have nice things.